What is the most that you have ever lost? A house? A career? A loved one? Perhaps your entire family? What would it be like to lose all of those things at once? To have them wrenched away from you in the last fleeting hours of your fading light? It's hard to imagine the torment that racked Napoleon Bonaparte's soul as he watched everything come crashing in towards him. To have soared to such breathtaking heights and to descend into such bitter cold and destitution. Napoleon was the master of Europe, the emperor of the French. The entire continent trembled at the sight of his army. He had won every battle, every campaign on his rise to emperor. His stunning victories had brought order to Europe. His order. His failed invasion of the Russian Empire had changed this dynamic almost instantly. The Grand Army of Napoleon had swept into Russia, 685,000 men sent on a single goal, to bring the Tsar low and conquer Russia once and for all. To say things didn't go according to plan is understating it substantially. The stiff resistance of the Russians to defend their homeland had ground Napoleon's advance down. When the frozen bite of General Winter arrived to save the Russian people, the great French emperor was forced to retreat, desperate to save his exhausted army from the plunging temperatures. 685,000 had started the campaign. Only 93,000 would escape the fury of Mother Nature, angry at the insolence of man. The conquered nations of Europe saw their chance to be free of the shackles of the French dominion. Rising against Napoleon and his shattered army, this led to yet another coalition against the French, culminating in the Battle of Leipzig, also known as the Battle of Nations. It was here that the French Empire began to collapse quickly. The Grand Empire is no more. It is France herself we must now defend, stated Napoleon to the Senate as the walls closed in around him. With the fall of Paris, his marshals turned against the emperor, forcing him to abandon his throne. Napoleon was sent into exile on the island of Elba, here to live out the rest of his days. He was so popular that the victors knew that nobody would tolerate any harm coming to this once great man. His wife and son had fled back to Austria, and Napoleon would never see them again. His life was over. Or was it? What would you do to get it all back? I imagine almost anyone would answer anything, and Napoleon would have agreed with you. It's difficult to imagine those quiet days on Elba, how his mind must have raced at the what-ifs that tormented his soul. Once the master of Europe, he was now reduced to the potentate of a small island. The 10 months on Elba had done nothing to quench the fury that burned in him. Every dispatch and letter he received showed his conquerors no longer united, nearing the verge of war with each other. His people, day by day, grew to miss their former master, yearning for his return and the end of the newly restored Bourbon monarchy. They had tossed out the decadent elite many years before in the Revolution. Now the people grew angry, hoping once again to be free of them. He could see the window of opportunity that presented, knew the hearts and minds of his people. The Allies were distracted. The hour had come for his return. Napoleon escaped from Elba, making landfall in France with his personal guard. And so began the 100 Days. Not a single shot was fired at his army as it swelled day by day, marching towards Paris as quickly as possible. The forces of the newly installed French king sent against him defected, still loyal to their emperor. At one point, Napoleon even stepped between his army and those forces sent to stop him. He ripped open his coat, proclaiming, "If any of you would shoot his emperor, here I am." The men melted into his arms. Still proud of their leader, their emperor, they loved him, and he in turn loved them. Napoleon entered Paris, free from his king who had fled in terror at his approach. He seized the reins of power, quickly raising armies while enacting his promised reforms to soothe the masses. The Allies, learning of Napoleon and his return, declared him an outlaw, putting aside their petty grievances to unite once more before the tide of history turned against them. Napoleon was forced to decide if he would simply defend his country or if he would strike out, attacking the enemy and taking the fight to them. Always a man of action, he elected to be aggressive, much as he has always been. A preemptive strike, aimed at the armies on France's doorstep. He knew the British were in Belgium with the Prussian army. If he could crush these armies quickly, the war would turn in his favor. His 128,000 men are more than enough to stand against each hostile army independently. United, however, he would be badly outmatched. Time was truly of the essence. And so, Napoleon began the final campaign of his life. Marching east and entering Belgium, Napoleon approached his enemy, ready for war. On the 15th of June, the first fighting began. Crossing the river near Charleroi, he thrust it between the two armies, driving a wedge between them. The next day, Napoleon dispatched his subordinate to take a key crossroad on his left flank with a smaller force, hoping to prevent the British and Prussian armies from uniting. The British fought off the French, barely able to stand their ground against the brutal onslaught. While this battle raged, Napoleon attacked the right flank, striking the Prussian army of Blücher. The battle was a slugfest, but the French gained the upper hand against the 72-year-old Prussian commander. Blücher personally led his cavalry in a charge towards the French. His horse was shot out from under him, barely fleeing with his life. His army in retreat, but did so in good order, regrouping when out of danger. The French gave chase with a smaller force as their main army now turned its full weight towards the British under the command of the Duke of Wellington. The next morning, learning of the fleeing Prussian army, Wellington ordered a retreat, understanding the danger approaching him. The rain showers pelted his army as it fell back to safety. He regrouped 8 miles south of the village of Waterloo. Receiving a pledge that the Prussian army would march to its aid, Wellington stopped, electing to stand and fight. It's hard to imagine the courage and commitment this took for Wellington. He was now facing off against the greatest European conqueror in history. He and his army stood alone, holding out now for only the promise of help. Wellington, however, was no fool. He set up his army under the protection of a ridge. Here he dug in, fortifying 3 farms that were spaced out in front of his army, one on the left, one on the middle, one on the right. He garrisoned them with his best troops, knowing their value well. Wellington's army was inexperienced. Most of his troops had never before seen a battle. This stands in stark contrast with Napoleon's army, with many of his most battle-hardened and seasoned veterans in the ranks. Evenly matched in numbers, it is Napoleon who has greater experience of war. If the Prussians do not come, Wellington knows that the battle is all but lost. The sun rises on the 3rd day of June, the 18th, 1815, a Sunday. The day is clear, the rain having ended. The troops that Napoleon has chasing the Prussians get pinned down against their rear guard, allowing the main force of Prussians to escape to begin marching back towards Waterloo. Waiting for the ground to dry from previous rains, Napoleon delays his assault, inadvertently buying time for the Prussians to arrive. Those hours would be sorely missed as the day dragged on. Sending a force to his left flank, Napoleon hoped that he can draw the British into protecting the area. All the while, he plans to march forward with his main army, striking the center of the British line. It is here that these crucial farms become so pivotal in this battle. The farms sit forwards of the main British line. The French must destroy them in order to reach the actual army behind it. The British fight like lions, holding as fast as they can against the hordes of French soldiers who grow desperate to crush them as fast as possible. It is here that the battle begins to turn against Napoleon. Unable to take this fortress on the left, his men begin to struggle. His entire strategy hinges on taking this fort, attacking the left, and drawing the British to weaken their center. After a brutal and massive cannon barrage, Napoleon commits his infantry, striking towards the center of the British line. The center remains strong, as no troops have been needed to reinforce the left. Withering musket fire shatters the rank of the French forward line as the British cavalry charge towards them. The French center disintegrates, abandoning their position and retreating back to their main line. The British cavalry, overwhelmed with glory, rides forwards. The French cavalry arrives in turn and crushes the British horsemen, saving the fleeing infantry from certain death. Hours later, thinking the British are retreating on the left, Marshal Ney rides out with his own cavalry, believing he is about to turn the tide of the battle. And he is right. However, it will be to turn the tide of battle in favor of the British, not his own army. The British form their famous squares, bayonets at the ready. The horses will not ride into such a formation and are forced to march around the British as they fire at them from all sides, decimating their cavalry. Without the support of infantry or artillery, the riders are massacred and flee for their lives. Napoleon is outraged at the shameful display, growing angry as things quickly mount against him. It is then that the Prussian army arrives, flanking Napoleon on the right. The fresh Prussian troops pour into battle. Their huge numbers quickly begin to overwhelm the French. It is in this critical moment that Napoleon, running out of options, orders his most elite men, the Imperial Guard, his final reserve, to march into battle. They head towards the center, desperate to rout at least one of the armies. The British pour their musket fire into them, finally fixing their own bayonets for one last charge. The Imperial Guard, the most feared soldiers in Europe, break ranks, fleeing for their lives as the British stand their ground. Wellington now knows that the battle has reached its final climax. He orders his entire army to charge the field, a general advance towards their destiny. Napoleon can only watch in horror as his army melts away, panicking and fleeing for safety. He barely escapes with his own life, abandoning his belongings as the Prussians ride towards him. A decade of rule now reduced to ash. The Great Alliance had prevailed. Wellington called Waterloo a damned near-run thing. 50,000 men were killed or wounded at Waterloo on both sides. Napoleon attempted to raise another army, eventually realizing that his time was finally up. Surrendering to the British, they once again restored him to exile, this time to St. Helena. Far away off the coast of Africa, they tucked him away. There would be no escape this time. It was here that he would live out the rest of his life, far removed from Europe, dying 6 years later. Well, that will do it for this week's episode. If you enjoyed the video, please click the like button and comment below. Also, if you could please click that subscribe and notification button to be kept in the loop on our future content. I try to upload at least once or twice a week. Thanks for watching.